Welcome back to Perspectives on Human Communication. This is an overview of agenda setting theory, which is of media theories. It's one of, I think, the most applicable theories to our current time. One, because there is such a short news cycle and such a pervasive news operation across social media, traditional broadcast, all of the streaming options. There is so much press and news coverage. And some of it has become even more dominant than back when this theory was first introduced, certainly when there were only three major news networks. And, newspapers were, of course, more prevalent, but the news cycle was much slower at the time. So we're going to introduce what this theory is about, what's underneath it in terms of social framing theory, and then we'll introduce the assumptions just to get us ready for the class conversation. So this theory, in a nutshell, is that the media play a significant role in shaping our view of what our political reality is. And so what does that mean? What are the issues and events that are of concern to us as we live together in a society? Second part of that is that we learn much of what's happening in our world through the news media because our interconnected electronic age, the media attaches importance to things by signaling our attention to them. And so in that way, perhaps they determine for us, and that's a really strong word, determine, but perhaps the media determines for us what issues are important and worth paying attention to. So that's the theory in a nutshell, the shaping of importance that then determines what we're going to think about and how we're going to think about it, perhaps. So some essential questions underneath this theory that I want to just put out there for you as we introduce this. One, can the media actually create an event through exposure, through putting it in their papers, putting it on their websites, putting it on their streams and television shows? Can they actually create the importance of an event? And I have a few examples there. For instance, Russiagate. That was the insinuation that the Trump campaign had colluded with Russian authorities to try to cheat the election. And of course, depending on which news sources you watched, early on, some news sources said this was absolutely true, and they quoted FBI sources and things like that. And then later on, it came out that the allegations were entirely false and fabricated. Or the focus of our attention on the whole Meghan Markle, Prince Harry disaffiliating with the royal family, moving to Canada. Is that really a story that warranted attention? And whose attention? How much of our attention has been focused on that story? Is it a story, worth paying attention to? Or even the January 6th Capitol insurrection. Was it a story of the magnitude that the press and the news media focused on it, or did they inflate that story? Did they make it bigger than it actually was? Did they use words to define it that perhaps distort what it actually was? Or in other cases, have they taken a story and minimized its importance, not shown it? So really, agenda setting is not only about what we're shown, but it's also about what we're not shown via the media channels. And to the extent that the agenda doesn't include things that maybe are important, but the media is not focusing on them. So keep that in mind as well. Can they create or eliminate exposure on a story? So another question is the statement that McCombs and Shaw came up with at the beginning of their theory as they capitalized on some previous ideas and studied a 1968 presidential election that really resulted in this theory. They said the media don't tell us what to think, but they do tell us what to think about. That's a question I want you to hold in your mind. Is that true? Do they just focus our attention, or do they actually tell us how to think about those things? So we're going to hold that question loosely as well. And then finally, can we actually validate this hypothesis that there is a cause-effect relationship between the media content and our perceptions, in the case of their original study, voter perceptions of issues, but in our broader question, just our perception of what issues are the most significant, the most important issues of our day. So we need to think about influence, like how do we go about creating influence, and is the media as influential as some people suggest? So the first question here is, do the media simply stroke pre-existing attitudes, or do they actually create, through selective exposure, create the attitude? And so that's the cause effect. We need to find a lag between the voters' perception of an issue and its importance and when the media first started reporting it or having it focused on. So we need to see that lag in order to determine a causal relationship. The cause, or the hypothesis, is that there is a cause-effect relationship between media content and then our perceptions of an issue as the public perception. And so that's how we will determine whether that not this influence actually exists. And we'll be able to determine the influence based upon the need for orientation, and that's going to result from a situation where the information is perceived as highly relevant, and a situation in which the person or the receiver has some degree of uncertainty, that they need some clarity on something. So it's going to come down to relevance and uncertainty in order to have influence. There's not going to be influence if somebody doesn't perceive a need or relevant information, and if they don't perceive any uncertainty in the situation. Before we get to the assumptions, let's talk for a second about what it means to frame something. And this really gets at the social theory underneath framing. Framing is a concept that's been around for a while, both in the anthropological literature and the sociological literature. And according to Gregory Bateson, an anthropologist, he said that frames are a durable cognitive model that allows us to interpret and evaluate messages around us. So really, if you step back from the actual involvement in a message or in an issue and think about the way that you're thinking about it, then you're analyzing the frame with which you understand it. Or from Irving Goffman, a sociologist, from his perspective, a frame is a schemata of interpretation. And schemata are really connections and processes that go on in your brain. So it's as if there's a roadmap in your brain for how you interpret things, and that's a schemata. And he says we rely on these to locate, perceive, identify, and label events, messages, life experiences. That's how we understand. So really think of it as a mental model that you bring to reality, and that's what we're talking about when we're speaking of a frame. And that's exactly what agenda setting is, what's behind or underneath agenda setting. It's the meaning-making systems. And we've got dominant meaning-making systems in our society that are called news organizations. So a more recent theorist talks about framing in this way. He says to frame a communicating text or message, what you do is promote certain aspects or facets of it, and you create this perceived reality, and then you make them more salient in such a way that you kind of lean toward or endorse a specific way of defining that problem, or a causal interpretation, a moral evaluation, or even a recommendation for how you should take action or treat that problem. And so Bernard Cohen said it this way in terms of agenda setting. He said, the press may not be successful much of the time in telling you what to think, but it is stunningly successful in telling its readers what to think about. And so that's really the gist of what McCombs and Shaw were saying behind agenda setting. So to give you a kind of an example to think about, ask yourself how the current immigration crisis is being framed on our southern border. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we're in class as well. But framing something, for instance, a government program, as a handout begins to give you a mental model, a cultural model of laziness. while you ignore the suffering and crisis in other dimensions of a crisis. If you just use that language, and you can see how this is done across a lot of current issues. The terms we use, the labels we use to frame something. So if you're talking about the abortion debate, do we call people who are advocating for the unborn people who are anti-abortion, or are they pro-lifers, right? Just those frames, those labels, change how we think about those people, whether they're anti-something or pro-something. And so these frames make a huge difference, and I think this is a really significant theory. So not only the framing, but also the actual coverage of something. We're living in an age where people are talking about cancel culture, and so this theory, I think, gets at that as well. How the news media, the big journalist organizations, how they are allowing expression or suppressing expression. And I think that that's a really relevant issue for our day. So what are the assumptions for this theory? Quickly, first, the media establish an agenda, and by doing that, they're not simply reflecting reality, but they're shaping and filtering it for us, the public. Second, the media's concentration on issues that comprise their agenda then influence what we talk about, what our agenda is. What are we talking about with our friends? What is the conversation out in the public sphere centering on? And the media topics, this theory suggests, are what drive those conversations. And then at the public policy level, the public and policymakers then influence the media's agenda kind of in a cycle fashion. So once the public catches the agenda and gets it in front of their policymakers or pressures them to do something about it, then that kind of reinforces or influences the media's agenda. So the question is, who starts it, right? Does the media start the topic? Does the public policymakers start the topic? Do public relations officials start the topic? And then once it catches hold in the cycle, in the news cycle, then the public gets a hold of it. It rises in their estimation of what's important, and that continues to drive the news cycle. So that's a quick overview of this theory. I look forward to talking about and testing this theory with you in class.